welcome back to my Stevenson Weekender Sailboat build. In this episode I'm going to get the cabin top fiberglassed in and faired, and then we'll build the cabin companionway hatch. If you remember from the episode where I built the cabin top, it's really not attached to the boat yet. It's only currently attached to the form that I use to mold the shape of the cabin top. So first I'm going to tab in the cabin top to the deck of the boat using these strips of fiberglass. These strips are 1708 biaxial fiberglass, and I found it was easier to get them saturated on the table first and then take them over to the boat. This was much easier than trying to saturate these strips in place. So once I got the strips where they needed to be, I used that little fin roller to squeeze out any air bubbles. As you can see in this shot, anywhere there was a deep irregularity, I used some thickened epoxy to fill in the void before I applied the strips. So now that those tabbing strips have cured, I'm going to move on to getting the 1708 fiberglass on the sides and the top. I'll start out by just getting everything cut and dry fit in place. So now that all the pieces are cut, I'll start out with a flood coat on the plywood. And now we'll get the pieces put back in place and ready to saturate with resin. For this part I'm using 2:1 high performance epoxy from TotalBoat. It did take quite a bit of epoxy to get this 1708 fully saturated. The method I found that worked best was to just pour the epoxy directly onto the fiberglass and then use a roller to spread everything around. I then used my fin roller to get out the air bubbles and use that little yellow squeegee to get the excess epoxy off of it. I had initially planned on just one layer, but I had enough of the fiberglass left over on the roll that I decided to do a second layer just for added strength. So this is how it looked after everything was saturated and then fin rolled and squeegeed. I then left that to cure overnight and then came back the next day and used this oscillating tool to trim off the excess fiberglass. Then I was able to begin to remove the mold that I'd used to shape the cabin. I was anxious to see if the cabin would hold its shape once the structure was removed. But I'm happy to say that after the mold was removed, I don't think the cabin top moved at all. So now I'll move on with getting this top faired out. And I'm once again using this two-part filler putty from TotalBoat. So far I've been really pleased with this stuff. It's easy to mix and it's easy to sand, and it's much cheaper than using thickened epoxy for everything. So just use that big wide sheetrock mud knife to ice this thing like a cake. I didn't show it all, but I sanded in between coats and did this 2 or 3 times until I had the entire cabin top fairly fair and covered in compound. So next I'm just moving down the checklist of things I need to get done before I paint the boat, and I'm going to cut out the front hatch and then the hole for the mast. I then applied trim around the opening and I built the hatch cover off camera. After everything is painted, I'll come back and attach this hatch top with hinges. Now I'm going to start work on the companionway hatch. I'd use that poster board you see on the left of the screen to make a tracing of the curvature of the hatch. I took the measurements off of that and I'll use them to create the curve I need on this board. This will be the stringer for the aft end of the hatch, and it needs to meet up with the cabin bulkhead, which is tilted forward on the boat about 26 degrees. So here I'm getting the table of the bandsaw set at that 26-degree angle, and then I'll get the stringer cut out. Now I'll mark out the shape for the forward stringer of the hatch. It does not need an angle cut into it, so I'll set the bandsaw table back at 90 degrees. In order to get the hatch frame glued together square, I attach this small block to the assembly table, and I can use that to clamp my boards to while they are glued and screwed in place. Once that glue had time to set, I then moved on to getting the piece of plywood attached to the top. I've designed this hatch so that the aft end of the hatch will have a 1-inch lip that overhangs the cabin bulkhead. So here I'm clamping the plywood in place so that I can come with this compass and make a mark along the edge of the aft end of the hatch that's 1 inch from that stringer. Now I'll get the plywood glued onto the frame, and I'm going to use 18 gauge brad nails to hold it in place, along with clamps while the glue dries. Here you can see that 1-inch overhang lip. I'm gluing on a second strip of plywood so that the appearance of the lip will be thicker when viewed on edge. I'll show you the finished product here in a little bit, then it'll make more sense. Once again, I let the glue dry, and now I'll move to this flush trim bit to get the sides and the back even with the stringers. I want the corners of the hatch to be rounded, so I found this piece of pipe that had the right radius and used it to mark the round on each corner. I'll use the sander here to sand down to my lines. finish the edges of the hatch with this 1/4 inch round over bit. So here it is in place on the boat. I won't permanently install it until I get everything painted. But there you can see that overhanging lip I was talking about earlier. As you can see, I have some of that fairing compound on there too that I'll need to sand down before I paint it. But I think I'll end this video here. If you're enjoying these videos, I'd humbly ask that you consider subscribing. As of the posting of this video in December 2023, I'm at 800 subscribers, and I'd love to get to 1,000 by the end of the year. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time as we continue to build the Stevenson Weekender Sailboat.